My name is Aaron Blake. I was 32 in 2019, and I lived out on the edge of Cook County, Minnesota, not far from the old taconite pits. I worked maintenance on scenic byways and spent nearly every free morning hiking the same loop to clear my head. I had a small blue heeler named Huck who came with me like a shadow. That afternoon, I was just going to check a trail camera I had left on a logging road 3 days earlier. I did not expect anything but deer or perhaps a fox. Huck stopped dead, his tail stiff, his nose high, and the air changed in a way I could not name. There was a wet, rotten smell that did not belong to anything I had smelled in these woods before, and then a silence that felt like someone holding their breath behind me. I turned and saw a shape moving at the tree line that was wrong in every bone I have. It was tall and bipedal, and its shoulders were wrong for any animal I know. It was not a bear. It was not a wolf. I fumbled for my Glock, and I remember thinking, this is ridiculous, and also, this is the only thing that might keep Huck alive. That night, I did not sleep. The next morning, I went back with a flashlight and a camera card, and I found prints and fur and something that made me stop believing that everything in the forest had a neat explanation. If you take your dog into the woods, listen to what I am about to say, because I never thought I would have to warn a neighbor about something that sounds like a folktale. The place where I walked was a patchwork of swamp and hardwood that happened to lie beside an old mining haul road and a privately owned gravel pit. The logging road I used cut through a stretch marked on maps as Birch Hollow, and it crested near a rusted-out culvert where a trail camera would catch deer coming to a salt lick. I knew every root and every rock on that route. My routine was precise. I set up cameras, checked the SD cards, fixed a gate or two, and then went home. I liked the rhythm of it. My neighbor Tom Avery would sometimes come with his border collie Max when he was off from the diner. Sheriff Cole dropped by the county office once and asked if anyone had reported strange animals. Ranger Hannah from the state park had warned us in the spring about increased bear activity. Mary Lang from the bait shop talked about tracks she had seen near the streaming pond, and Jesse the geology student who lived on the outskirts would text me photos of odd fur he found. I mention names because none of us are actors in a story we invented. We are people who live near each other, and who traded bar talk and a beer for years. The morning I went to check the camera, Huck was pawing at the truck cab and acting like he could smell something under the hood. The air was cold and damp, with the metallic tang of iron from the mine, and with something else I could not place. I carried a small pack with a multi-tool, my Glock in a holster, a spare magazine, the trail camera, a notebook, and snacks. I felt prepared, the same way a man might feel prepared to fix a flat tire. I did not feel prepared to look at footprints that did not match any animal guide in my trunk. I have always been drawn to the outdoors. As a kid, I spent afternoons hunting tadpoles, climbing pines, and learning to read animal signs from my grandfather. He taught me to follow tracks not just with my eyes, but with my stomach. I learned how to skin a squirrel and how to listen to the woods. I went to a community college for forest science, but life folded differently. My father died when I was in my early 20s in a skid on an icy road, and that broke something steady inside me. After that, I took odd maintenance jobs and worked shifts that let me breathe. The woods were my refuge from grief and from a life that had a way of closing doors too fast. I married once, and the marriage lasted only 2 years. The divorce left me neat and cautious, and also stubborn in the way only a person who has lost some certainties becomes. Huck came to me through a woman from church who could not keep him. I promised Huck a longer life than the marriage had given me, and I kept that promise by taking him everywhere. I tell you this because my background is not a sheet of sensational claims. It is a string of small survival choices that led to a man who knows how to read tracks, and who would, at first, still gamble on the simplest answers when the forest whispered otherwise. The first contact was the kind you feel in your teeth and in your throat. Huck gave a single high-sounding yelp, and then a low scratch noise that came from deep in his chest. I dropped the camera and the SD card skittered in the mud. The smell came again, and I remember the way my scalp tightened. It was acid and rotten, and also like a wet animal. I heard a twig snap, and then a soft step, like a heavy boot, and then a slow inhale so loud it sounded like someone breathing through a wet wool scarf. I saw movement among the birches, and at first it read as a man in a coat, but when it stepped out, there was a lean to the frame and a coat of fur along the shoulders that reflected the light. I could make out a long arm and hands that were too long for a human. The eyes were forward and bright in the low sun, and they were not the round black of a deer. They were set and hard and clever. Huck lunged, and I yelled. The thing did not bolt. It watched Huck catch the air, and then it advanced with a sideways gait that made the leaves rustle in a rhythm that felt orchestrated. I tried to aim my Glock, but my hands shook, and the shot that came off was not a warning. It was a scatter, because my mind refused to believe what it saw. The creature flinched like any animal would flinch at the sound of a gun, but then it turned and moved away easily on two legs into a thicker stand of spruce. I remember the sound of branch tips swishing and something like a wet thud as it stepped over a log. Huck was bleeding a little from his flank and yelping. I wrapped him in my jacket and felt a heat in my chest that was not fear like adrenaline, but a deeper, older fear that felt like being stared at by a predator that understands you are animal and therefore edible. Dialogue in that first major scene happened quickly and in pieces because the people who arrived later were neighbors and friends, and their voices braided with the forest in a way I could record only later. Tom ran up the road shouting. He came first with breath that cut cold. "Aaron, what happened?" he asked. "Huck got cut," I said. "Where did it go?" Tom asked again. "Into the trees," I answered. "You see it?" he pushed. "I did," I said. "It walked on two legs," Tom scoffed, and then he went quiet because he saw the prints by the culvert and understood. "Sheriff Cole is coming," Mary said on her phone. "We need to get Huck in the truck," Tom said. "Get a clean bandage," Mary ordered. "What is that thing?" Jesse asked as he bent and ran a gloved hand along a track. "I do not know," I said. "But it left hair, and those tracks are not bear tracks," Ranger Hannah said as she stepped in and bent to measure the stride. "It smells like an animal and like something that eats meat," Cole said when he arrived, his voice even. "We will get Huck patched," he added. The exchanges were quick, but there were at least 8 actual turns of questions and answers before the men split off to follow the trail and before the women called people for supplies. In that whole first cluster of events, there were sensory details that kept stacking until disbelief unraveled. The smell of iron and wet fur on the breeze. The sound of Huck whimpering under my jacket like a machine hurt. The sight of prints that were long and narrow at the front like a crooked human toe, but with an impression that suggested claws. The taste of metal in my mouth after the gunshot. The texture of the fur stuck to a broken branch like carpet fibers. I tried to catalog these senses to make them real to myself, because a list feels less dreamlike than a single memory. After the immediate adrenaline, and after Huck was bandaged with veterinary tape from a neighbor who used to do small animal rescue, the group split. Tom took Huck and drove him to the vet in Grand Marais, even though Huck was not life-threatening. Sheriff Cole and Ranger Hannah went to record tracks and take photographs. Jesse came because he wanted to test a sample of the fur under a microscope. Mary hung back and cried once and then went to the bait shop to warn other folks. I drove home and felt both stupid and hollow. I kept thinking about the way the creature had watched us, and how it did not rush away in the way a wounded bear would. It was almost measured. I will not gloss over the technical parts because they matter when people ask me why I did not just file everything with some agency. The trail camera I used was a Scout Guard 560, set to 3-shot burst and motion activation. I pulled the SD card and removed it in a glove to avoid contamination. The prints were measured using a standard forensics method. We used a carpenter square and string to map stride, and a silicone casting kit to take a cast of the deeper print. The haircut of the first sample was photographed at 10x and 40x and then stored in a sealed bag. Ballistics were simple. I fired one warning shot into a stump and collected the shell casing to match to my Glock in case anyone questioned the legal shooting. The protocol is basic but important because agencies want chain of custody. Someone asked me why I did not call the university and hand over the sample. The truth is, I did not trust that anything we handed innocent to someone would come back with explanations that made sense. I wanted evidence sheltered while I decided the next move. A few nights later, my friend Ruth Donovan called. She was the kind of neighbor who kept a spare key and a jar of sugar. She had driven into town and saw 3 cars parked by the road close to where I had been. She asked a man in one of the trucks if they had seen anything. He looked at her hard and said, "You do not want to mess with that." Ruth told me the way his face looked, like he was trying to hold a secret. That set the hair on my neck again. People around here have superstitions. People around here have reasons to lie. I later learned that a logger named Frank, who lived 2 rows over, had also filmed something weird on his dash cam when he left the pit just after midnight. He sent the clip to a cousin who posted a still shot to a local message board. The screenshot showed a shape crossing the road on 2 legs. When Sheriff Cole called Frank to ask about the clip, Frank went quiet and then said he would rather leave it alone. That was the texture of the community reaction, a mixture of curiosity and a wall of refusal to say more. About 10 days after the first sighting, there was a second incident, and this one was worse. It happened at dusk on the ice shore of a small lake I had named Portage Hollow because I used to drag my canoe across its narrow neck. A woman in her 40s named Laura had come up with 2 friends to fish and to clear her head after losing her job in Duluth. She set up a small propane lantern at a tent and they had a modest fire. In the night, she woke to a sound like someone dragging a stick around the tent and then to something pressing against the canvas. She says she could smell meat and cold breath close to her face through the thin nylon. She said she felt a heavy weight sit on the other side like a person leaning. Laura told me later that her first thought was pranksters. When she unzipped the door, there was a hot, trashy smell and a bright burn of ozone, and she saw a head looking back at her. It was not human. It had a long shape to the face and a nose that was flat and wet. Its ears were set back, and its eyes glowed with a sense of appraisal rather than hunger. She shouted, and her friends came out with flashlights. The creature did not run. It stood up on 2 legs and stared for a full 30 seconds, as if counting them. Then it turned and walked away. The scene at Portage Hollow had at least 5 strong sensory markers. The chill that hammered in the bones of people who had been warmed by a fire, the acrid smell that made the inside of the tent taste like burnt meat, the sound of nylon rustling like a soft rain, the sight of that long face lit by lantern and moon, the feel of boots sinking in wet sand as they chased it a short distance only to find a smear of blood on a rock and deep prints that led into the alders. Dialogue from Laura and her friend Meg when I interviewed them later shows how rational minds can flip in an instant. "Did you get a look at its hands?" Meg asked. "They were wrong," Laura answered. "Like long fingers with dark nails?" Meg said. "It had a collar," Laura added. "A collar," Meg repeated as if in disbelief. "Yes, it had a collar. And a tag that looked like it had been carved," Laura said. "We ran because it felt like being watched by something that knows how to plan," Meg said. I asked why they did not report it. They said, because when you tell authorities, the reaction can be a flat line of polite doubt and the same questions about alcohol and neurotransmitters that feel like blame. Sheriff Cole did take the cast and the photos, but the prosecutor would later say they had to clear resources for human victims first. The encounter that shook me most was not the first, and it was not the second. It was the third, and it happened to a man named Daniel who delivered mail along County Road 7. Daniel had been driving before dawn, and he rounded a stretch of red pines and saw a silhouette walking along the ditch. He hit his brakes hard, and the shape turned and stared at him. Daniel said that its head cocked in a human gesture that made all his instincts flare. He stepped out, and the creature did not immediately attack. They stood there like two neighbors arguing about where the fence line began. Daniel said he could see a collar plate swinging on the creature like a human dog collar, but with a tag that had letters worn down. Daniel spoke to it because he thought for a moment that it might be some local hunter in a suit. He said, "You are not supposed to be here," and the creature responded with a low sound that was not a grunt and not a growl. Daniel, a man who grew up on a farm and who had seen all sorts of strange things, reported the feeling of recognition and of cold appraisal, and then he reached into his truck for a shotgun, and everything escalated. The scene with Daniel contained a long dialogue sequence when Sheriff Cole and Ranger Hannah interviewed him and other neighbors later. "It was standing in the ditch," Daniel said. "Like a person," Cole said. "Describe it," Hannah pressed. "It had fur," Daniel said. "How big?" Cole asked. "Maybe 6 foot," Daniel said. "Did it show aggression?" Hannah asked. "No," Daniel said. "It just watched me, then it tilted its head and made a sound." Cole asked what the sound was, and Daniel tried. "It was like a croon, like someone warming up a throat," Daniel answered. "Did you shoot?" Cole asked. "I did," Daniel said. "I fired 1 shot in the air, and it flinched, but it did not run. Then it turned and walked away toward the ravine and disappeared." That exchange had 7 turns, and a cadence of it was the rhythm of men and women trying to make sense of an encounter that did not fit neatly into a standard box. There were moments of tension during that meeting that I will never forget, paragraphs in my memory that feel like short loops of wired elastic. One of those moments was when Daniel showed us the shotgun, and we lined up beside his truck and walked the ditch in twilight. The woods made a sound like wool rubbing against wood. The smell of wet fur returned, and I felt a hand in my stomach. We found the prints, and the depth where the heels sank told us the weight had concentrated on the toes. For a long breath, I thought we might see something moving through those pines. Another moment of tension came when Jamie, who runs the feed store and who is an absolute skeptic, reached down to examine a fur fragment, and his hand came back shaking. He swore, and we all held that silence for a long time. The tension was not cinematic. It was close and small and real. It was the kind that makes men stop arguing about theories and start cleaning guns. A community reaction started to form lines. Some people wanted to keep quiet. Others wanted to post everything to the local page. Sheriff Cole called the state wildlife office, and they sent a biologist named Dr. Ellis, who drove up from the university. Dr. Ellis walked the casts with a clinical eye and said the tracks were ambiguous. He recorded the stride and took measurements. At one point he said, "This could be a malformed bear or a person wearing a suit and altering its gait," but his voice was careful. Dr. Ellis wanted samples for DNA testing, and he asked that we handle the chain of custody properly. That is when we made our second set of paper trails. I put the smallest hair sample in a paper envelope and wrote the date and my name on it. I drove the cast in a cooler to the county lab and left everything with the clerk. Officer Patel, who works under Sheriff Cole, filled out the paperwork, and the forms were stamped. In theory, the science would decide. In practice, science can take time, and communities need answers faster than the lab returns results. After 3 weeks, there was a spike of sightings in the county. People reported dogs behaving oddly, lights in the tree lines, and car dashcam footage with shapes. Someone painted a crude warning sign at the trailhead. 5 to 8 named people took action. Tom taped up a laminated note with phone numbers, and Mary offered to keep a logbook at the bait shop. Jesse scanned the hair and emailed what he saw to Dr. Ellis. Ruth checked on me daily and brought warm coffee in the morning when I refused to sleep in my bed. Frank kept to himself and stayed off the message board after his clip went up. Those names are not decoration. They are the way this story collected bodies and voices. 2 days into the public attention, a small but important technical result arrived. The lab called and said the hair sample did not match any common local cervid, canid. The mitochondrial hair markers were inconclusive for canine classification, and the microsatellite profile did not return a clear match to documented bear sequences. That is the kind of sentence that makes people lean forward and then lean back. Dr. Ellis told us he needed more samples and that contamination could create odd results. He requested that anyone who had touched the sample not handle anything else and that additional casts be made. The tone of his voice was both encouraging and careful. He told me to log every contact we had with the evidence and to bring additional hair samples if we found them. That was the point when I started sleeping with a flashlight under my pillow. The escalation reached a peak exactly 49 days after the first incident. It was near the old taconite hauler, and a man named Pete, who runs seasonal maintenance work for the county, came across a deer carcass slashed open and a trail leading away. Pete had seen the pattern of the community chatter, and he knew to call Sheriff Cole. When Cole and his deputies arrived, they found not just the carcass, but a cluster of tracks that walked upright through the thawing mud. The smell was terrible. There were strips of fur and a ragged piece of what looked like leather that could have been a collar. I went with Ranger Hannah to document the scene, and the thing I remember most was the way daylight revealed details the moon tried to hide. The prints were too narrow in the toes, and the stride was long. There was hair matted in clumps along the nearby shrubs. We recorded everything as if the act of recording could make it less unreal. The community reaction to that was split in predictable ways. Mary shut the bait shop earlier and taped a copy of the sheriff's phone number to the door. Tom started organizing groups of men to walk the outskirts of the property at night in shifts. Some of the men brought rifles and some of them brought iron bars. I was with the men who had shot at something before and who felt responsible to protect others. We practiced safe handling, and we tried to lay down rules about not provoking anything. There were arguments about whether to set out lights or to set traps. Sheriff Cole asked us to refrain from vigilante tactics. He tried to mediate and to get the state to bring resources. He had to answer questions from a county attorney, and his words were chosen like stones thrown slowly across the water to avoid splashing. 2 moments of tension during that night sit like knives in the memory of those of us who were awake. One is when a flashlight sweep across the trees caught a pair of bright reflective eyes, and then a silhouette slipped between the trunks like a curtain closing. No one moved at first. Then someone shouted and the men ran. Fired 2 warning shots into the air. The animal did not run in the way of a frightened creature. Instead, it appeared to turn, and then it beheld us as if counting how many guns were pointed at it. The second moment happened when a dog named Max was left by mistake outside. I ran toward the sound, and a blood-curdling scream cut off like someone had snapped a line. We found Max a short distance away with a ripped ear and a half-torn collar. He was alive but terrified, and from then on, no one left a dog out. Those incidents condensed fear into a practical rule. About a month later, Dr. Ellis called to say that the lab had something interesting. The hair sample had sequences that matched no known database entry entirely. Some loci matched canine lineages faintly, and some matched nothing. He used the terms novel and ambiguous and asked for patience. He recommended a local university study. He also suggested that we keep the physical evidence in a secure location and not let pictures of certain close-up samples leak online. That is an odd request in a world where everything is uploaded. There is a tension between wanting to prove things and wanting to protect a community from hysteria. We chose to keep the most incriminating close-up images off the public boards. I want to pause here and speak to you if you are watching and feeling the same cold tickle of disbelief that ran my spine at the beginning. If you are feeling that hum of alarm and curiosity, know that you are not alone. If you have a short story of a dog that went silent or a trail where footprints looked wrong, write it, starting with the phrase, "on the trail." Tell us the place and the time and describe the smell. Your lines may sound small now, but when strung together, they allow people to see patterns. Your comments help us map what is happening. The community I live in used a logbook at the bait shop, and comments there helped us understand that sightings clustered around certain pits and near certain marshes. That is useful. Post concise details. Do not embellish. If you have photos, attach them. We will read them and we will respond if we see useful clusters. After you post, please come back because I still have more to tell and the story continues. After the online thread warmed up, strangers started showing up. Some left offerings that looked like jerky and were probably meant as a sort of appeasement. Others left cameras and then left quietly. A small band of people from a neighboring county tried to set a motion-triggered floodlight and it was smashed the following morning. There were rumors that a trap had been set and that a homemade snare had been interfered with, and that implied a strange intelligence. People whispered about a pattern in the behavior. As if the creature was not simply an animal, but an actor with motive. The sheriff reminded us often to document and not to escalate. By the time the university team arrived, I had become, partly by accident, the person with the best organized notes. I had records of sightings, a paper bag with hair, the cast of footprints, and a folder of witness statements. Dr. Ellis led a small team that set up motion cameras and took soil samples. They used ultraviolet light to search for blood residue. They measured stride and toe spread again. They cataloged the prints with a standardized grid and took GPS coordinates. The technical details matter because a well-documented event is harder to dismiss. The team also recommended that we tag any dogs left outside and to keep a radio channel open for those on night patrol. The longest and most frightening single night happened when 3 of us decided to keep watch along a common stretch of road with cameras and radio support. Tom, me, and Jamie sat in a truck late and talked in low voices about our families and about how the woods had changed. Huck lay curled under my seat. The temperature dropped and breath fogged in the cab. At around 2 in the morning, Huck rose and whimpered and then gave one long, low bark. Tom flicked a flashlight and we both saw a tall silhouette crossing the scrape of moonlight on the road. It moved with a steady roll. The hair at the back of my neck went rigid. I reached for my Glock, but my hands felt thick. The creature paused, turned, and looked directly at us. The look was not predatory. The look seemed to measure whether we were a threat or something to avoid. It took one step closer, and the truck radio hissed and then died. The engine tried to catch and failed. We were silent long enough that sound became a quantity. The creature sniffed dead air like tasting a page. Then it walked on the side of the road and vanished into the black between trees, into a ravine. We watched the place it had been until the last eyes of it faded into the dark, and then we left. We did not speak much on the drive home. The next day, our cameras showed movement but no clear image. The night tightened something in 3 of our lives. We started locking doors earlier. Moments of tension like these were not singular. They recurred and they infected ordinary choices. I stopped going alone. Huck came with me always, leashed, muzzled when needed. I slept with a flashlight and not always under the covers. I texted people when I left and when I arrived. Those are small habits that change a life. The change in the county had a measure. Husbands drove wives to work. People did not leave boats along the shore overnight. A small church group started calling a watch roster for the campground. The fear was practical and stubborn. It was the kind of change that accumulates into a new normal. 6 named people had direct encounters that I can name now: Tom, Mary, Jesse, Ruth, Laura, and Daniel. Others told smaller stories of tracks and of noises. Some of our neighbors' livestock lost weight and had wounds that could not be explained. Sheriff Cole filed a short report, and then, when the state lab returned more ambiguous notes, the public interest cooled and people settled into their new borders. The university team left with a box of samples and a promise to analyze further. Dr. Ellis sent a preliminary note to the state saying the samples were worthy of more testing and that they might represent an unclassified mixture of traits. That word unclassified hangs in a useful place. It keeps people uncomfortable and curious. One technical description I must include for the record is the casting method used for the principal print. We used a silicone-based casting compound mixed to a medium viscosity and poured into the cleaned and propped depression after photographing from 4 angles. The cast cured in 35 minutes and was removed intact. The cast showed toe impressions with slight webbing and a narrow phalangeal spread inconsistent with typical ungulate or ursine patterns. We bagged the cast in polyethylene and labeled it with date and GPS coordinates. That procedural note is small, but it is the kind of concrete action that turns stories into dossiers. Now the epilogue that I promised. 1 month after the first sighting, things were raw and the nights were still new. People slept with radios and dogs inside each house. Huck healed slowly and would not cross certain clearings without looking over his shoulder. The bait shop log had 19 separate entries, and Sheriff Cole had a file thick enough to get the county attorney's attention. Dr. Ellis had preliminary sequencing data that could not be published, but that indicated anomalies. The university asked for another sample, and we scouted for more hair. I found a few more clipped tufts on a branch in a shallow gully, and Jesse packed them into a sterile tube and drove to the university that same day. Our little community had become a small network of watchers and recorders. There was less scoffing among neighbors now, and more practical talk about times and radios. Some people left town. The diner emptied out of people for a few nights. I realized how fragile habits are when they have to change overnight. 3 months after the start, the county had settled into a weary rhythm. The lab had produced more analysis, but not a full answer. Parts of the genetic sequences suggested a canine baseline, and parts suggested an unknown variant. Dr. Ellis recommended further testing and sought funding to expand the study to other counties where similar reports had appeared. The university agreed to a limited grant, and the team returned. With infrared setups and more specialized traps for hair collection, we agreed to share footage only with the team to avoid panic. Local schools had assemblies about trail safety, and Sheriff Cole gave a talk about the importance of calling in sightings and of not confronting unknown animals. The conversation moved from speculation to safety protocols, and a map of hotspots was started and shared among landowners. People who had never talked much before exchanged numbers. The fear had been sorted into instruction and into a kind of solidarity. 6 months in, the world was quieter but thinner. The initial frenzy had calmed, and yet no one slept the same. I could not sleep past 3 o'clock without checking the porch light. Huck would sometimes whine in his sleep and jerk like he remembered a sound. Dr. Ellis sent a final preliminary report to the county that suggested we might be looking at a previously undocumented population of canine with morphological quirks or at culturing of domestic animals into aberrant forms. He wrote that more samples over time could refine the picture. Sheriff Cole met with the state, and they agreed to fund more testing and to create an interagency task force for strange wildlife events. Our community adapted. We learned to mark trails, to keep pets inside at night, and to travel in pairs when we had to go out after dark. I stopped going to my favorite hollow without company. I still go sometimes during the day to check cameras, but I never stay after dusk. In the end, the thing that changed the most was not the presence of the creature itself, but the way 3 people and a handful of neighbors stopped sleeping normally. Tom began carrying earplugs and still woke at the smallest noise. Laura sold her tent and bought a camper with lockable doors. Daniel stopped delivering on certain routes and took a job that kept him in town. I keep the hair samples in a locked case, and a copy of the cast sits on a shelf. When someone asks me whether I still believe in a simple explanation, I say that I believe in careful documentation and in measured responses. I also say that there are places where folklore and biology meet and argue, and sometimes we do not have a referee to tell us which is right. If there is one practical lesson here for you, it is this. If you go into remote places, take precautions. Tell someone where you are going. Take a charged radio or phone and carry protective tools that you can legally use. Keep pets on a short leash. Record everything you can, photograph, and protect samples from contamination. Do not provoke. And know that even in a modern system, sometimes answers take time. We are still waiting for conclusive science, and in the meantime, we live with a list of small changes that keep us safer than our old habits. I am telling you. This because I think the story matters, not because it will resolve into a neat headline, but because our community kept records and because some things can be mapped. I have more footage and more notes, and I plan to update those who want to follow this. If you live near Birch Hollow or Portage Hollow or along County Road 7, be careful at night. If you take your dog into the woods, watch their body language and look for prints that do not match the guides. And remember that sometimes the thing that changes a life is not a single encounter, but a string of small, fearful decisions that remap the way you sleep. I do not know what the creature ultimately is. I only know what it taught us about paying attention and about the thin veil between habit and fear.